everyone, welcome to week 8. This week we're talking about universal design. So what is universal design? I'm going to actually start this definition by telling you what it's not. To begin, I'm going to give you an anecdote for which you have to know that I'm 5 foot 1 inch tall, which probably doesn't come across in this video because I'm sitting down. So this height means that things like public benches, chairs, tables at restaurants, kitchen counters are all easily accessible to me for the most part. I have some issues getting to high bar stools, but I digress. But it also means that these things aren't really at the ideal ergonomic position for someone of my height. If I'm in some, on some benches or, for example, on airplanes, I can find myself, if I flatten on my foot, I can swing my legs without hitting the floor. If I, point my toes, I hit the floor, but if I keep my feet flat, anyway, again, I digress. So for the last 3 years that I lived in Minnesota, which is where I lived before I moved to Pensacola, my apartment didn't have a dishwasher, so I had to do dishes by hand. And when I was washing dishes, I kind of had to bend over the sink in this really awkward way because I'm so short. I had to move my arms up and over the sink to get my hands into the dishes, and this posture gave me some pretty freaking back pain. And I was in a grumpy mood one night after having done dishes, and I posted angrily about this counter situation on Facebook. And then a friend of mine who was easily 6'5", maybe even taller, replied that, well, kitchen counters and kitchen sinks aren't exactly built for him either, and he has similar painful experiences washing dishes. And through this conversation, I found out that actually standard kitchen counter in U.S. kitchens is best designed for someone who is about 5'7". So in this case, if you're 5'7", great, the counter has been designed for you. But this counter issue is an example of something designed for a specific group of folks, so people who are 5'7" to be exact. This is the exact opposite of universal design. Universal design just means that something is designed for the maximum number of people possible, with all kinds of physical presences and physical and mental abilities. The concept actually comes out of environmental design and architecture. So in the 60s and 70s, there was this large movement to create building environments that were accessible to people with physical disabilities. According to North Carolina State University's Center for Universal Design, a large portion of this movement was driven by World War II and Vietnam War veterans who were coming back from the war with new physical disabilities. And these disabilities meant that they had more difficulty getting around their workplaces than before. So things like buildings with no elevators, for example, suddenly posed problems to these vets that they hadn't posed before. And over time, various legislation has been enacted that enabled people who needed to use canes, wheelchairs, etc., to get around these physical environments in new ways. And then eventually the people who are studying environmental design hit on something. It's like, well, when you actually design an environment to be available and accessible to the most people possible, no matter what physical or mental ability is, the design actually benefits everyone, and it certainly benefits people that you didn't really consider perhaps in the beginning of your design. So the TED Talk video that's required content for this week is a lot of really great examples of how universal design benefits everyone. And it talks a lot about the importance of universal design. But you guys aren't architecture students. What do elevators have to do with digital writing? Well, universal design is just as important online as it is in real life. Web designers want as many users as possible to be able to use the website they're creating. And there are certain barriers to access online that might keep people from using a site, ranging from images with no text description to improper signaling of links on a website. So you're probably using a template through an online platform like WordPress or Wix to create your portfolio, and that will mean that some things you won't have control over. But I'm going to share with you a few examples of universal design principles that I will expect your e-portfolios to embrace. So I'll start by giving an extended example of universal design on the web first, and then talk really briefly about several other principles and some examples of these principles in action. So first, say you're writing a blog post, which you will do later in the semester. You want to support a claim you're making in that blog post by linking to an article you read on, I don't know, CNN.com. So you create a link to that article, and the link is signaled by a different color than the rest of the text. Say, most of the text is dark gray, and then the color that you're using for your links is green. Depending on what shade you're using, someone with a particular kind of color blindness might not actually be able to see that the link is any different from the rest of that gray text. But that doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't use green. Instead of not using green, you could simply add an underline to the link text. So this is two things. First of all, it makes it easier for everyone, even people without color blindness, to see that there's a link there. Again, whether or not they're colorblind or not. So if it's green and underlined, even someone without color blindness, that extra visual signal signals that that's still a link, and so people without color blindness benefit from that as well. But it does also make sure that color is not the only thing signaling the link. So the link is still accessible to people with that visual disability. So that's kind of a detailed example. I'm going to go through now a couple of the universal design principles and give a few quicker examples. So one of the principles is be simple and intuitive, and one technique for doing this is to provide feedback to the user. In terms of web design, this is why most navigation menu items and links change in some way when you hover the mouse over them. That's called feedback. Another principle is to include redundant modalities, like using text to label images. Including captions under images is important on the web, but so is providing what's called alternate text. Blogging and website platforms like WordPress will give you the option to provide alternate text that will be accessible to screen readers, which people with low vision or with blindness will use to access the internet. So this is definitely something that you should do, and it's something you should consider as you're creating your ePortfolio. So I wanted to give you a few examples, but now I want you all to kind of do a bit of exploring and thinking through this topic via this week's discussions, of which there are two. One is a brief analysis of how universal design principles are at work or are not at work in a website of your choosing, and the other asks you to consider how you'll make your ePortfolio adhere to the principles of universal design. So that consideration is going to be important in your design document and script, which is your next big assignment. And that's all for now. Have a great week.